Well, hello, welcome to this new video where I clearly had to explain what I was talking about yesterday when I tried to make a video because I figured there would be like millions of video talking about the Canon RP, and I was just trying to pick out one little detail about the camera or a feature of the camera. So I called the topic, if I remember correctly, one area where the Canon RP kills Sony, and then I showed you a picture of the grip. I figured it was obvious I was just talking about the grip, but clearly I was not, so let me try to show you what I was talking about. This is also the first video where I'm trying to sort of use a new setup, which I'm trying to keep as small as possible, but I am playing with things to putting myself into the background, using an iPhone and few cameras and simple switchers. I might show it in a later video. But let's get back to what I was talking about yesterday and then talk about the main topic where I really think different companies are now. So, yesterday, for the people who didn't get my Dutch humor, I was talking basically about this part. So let me zoom in a little bit. So what Sony didn't do on the top is basically create a way to be able for things like L brackets or grips. I don't want to get the Sony one, but I do own the Sony one, to be able to securely lock them at the bottom of the camera. So if you look at my current camera I'm using now, so this is the A7R3, it's using the new grip from our L bracket from Smallwick, and there's only one point where it can connect to the body. Then on the front of it there is a little bit of a way to, let's say, grab it, but they didn't make it easy. So the area that I was talking about is the area that Canon did, is basically allow for a better way to attach grips on the bottom of the camera. And I'm a big fan of that. Why am I a big fan of that? Because I am totally convinced that we are now slowly but surely seeing a compromise in sizes of cameras. And I'm a big believer that different camera sizes for different people is a good thing. Both the hand sizes but also the use cases are just different. And I think that if you try to make one big DSLR or one really small mirrorless, it just doesn't work. So you need to figure out how to extend it in a logical way. Now the only solution so far was using a battery grip, and a battery grip, even that sometimes is a bit iffy, but it was the only solution, and mostly it would add like 4 centimeters. That's not really an ecosystem. And the only thing I was talking about yesterday, because I wanted to be a bit different than everybody else, is to say, well, this is an area where Sony kind of started the game, because when they released the A7R3 or the A9, I'm not completely sure anymore, they actually released what we started calling the Pinky Grip. And the Pinky Grip was quite a nice solution, where it added about 2 centimeters to the body. And as a result, because the idea was good but the implementation was really bad, in my opinion, several companies started developing these types of brackets, right? So things like adding 2 centimeters, or the Mikey one, which basically copied the Sony one but added Arca plates, which we wanted. So that is basically what I was talking about yesterday. So, but clearly that was too difficult for people to follow, or they didn't want to even watch the video far enough to get to that point. So let's really talk about, I guess, where Sony now is compared to some of the others. Now, let me first say I am a nerd, right? So my whole thing is being nerdy about cameras, video, audio, film, all kinds of topics. So I like to help companies. If you look a few videos back, you will find that I made a video about co-creation and how I'm trying both in my work and also as a part of my hobby, like in photography, try to sort of come up with solutions that some companies listen to and others don't, right? And that's fine. That's my little niche. Only have a few followers, and that's what I do. So in this case, I'm now trying to make this mini studio. I'm trying to make it as small as possible, and I can actually kind of show you if you want. So let me quickly give you a hint what I'm doing now. And let me turn this camera on, that might help. And show you a picture on it, if I can make that work. Yep, let's see. So pull this one back, and as you can see, I'm clearly not that used to the system, but so this is on my A7R3 at the moment that you're seeing on the table. And this is kind of the setup that we are now looking at. So you see that I'm trying to do is use an iPhone, in this case also as a green screen solution with the background you're seeing. Not sure how well that's working already, because I still need to add to the lights. But then you will see that I'm using a second iPhone, which is basically controlling my streaming box. Then a preview monitors, and the last one you see my output monitor, which goes to the small box which you see on the side. So the really small black box, and that's basically the streaming box that's streaming it out to YouTube at the moment. So I'm trying to fiddle with small little parts. That's basically what I do. So now that we have talked about that, let's get back to business and talk about where I think the camera brands are at the moment, and who is in the lead and why. And I've made these videos before, and I think this is also a good moment, although I am not sure how sharp I am today, because I'm also fiddling with some of these buttons for the first time. But I want to make a few points. I was talking to David Osler, and I was also, over time, I'm also talking to other YouTubers, which are have much more visitors than I do, and also get review units, which I don't get. I buy all my own stuff, because I'm basically just doing my own thing, and that's it. But I was talking to him, and he actually convinced me of a point, and that was about the flippy screen. And I talk about this simply because I think it kind of makes sense of what is now happening and what's going to happen. So I am a strong believer that whatever Sony does, it's most likely is going to be, the RP is most likely going to be the most popular camera of 2019. And many people won't like that, and I don't think it makes sense. But I do think that David and others are correct in saying, even if the camera is bad, and I think from a practical point of view, it is probably about the same as the A7 version 2. And that was not that great of a camera, to be fair. The Generation 3 cameras are much better. But that does not really matter, because I think for many people, if they go into a shop, they see the Canon brand, they see the flip out screen, that's all they kind of want to see and all they are willing to see. And that's what it is. It's the brand that will most likely take the lead once again. And if you think about that, that in fact is not that bad, and it's probably also the best that Sony was sort of hoping for. The reason Sony was hoping for this, sorry, I have to turn off one of the series which decided to join in. The reason why this is a good result for Sony is because if we look back a few years, and we even look back to last year, the whole story was that, let's say, first go back a few years. Sony cameras sucked, and they sucked in many ways. Sony was only a technology company, and they would never be as good as the camera companies, especially Nikon and Canon. Because it was an electronics company, and it would never be able to do what the other two companies were doing. That clearly quite quickly changed when they started first releasing new bodies in an extremely fast fashion and iterating them really quickly. And they, over the last 2 years, added quite a good lens setup. So we are now in the situation, somehow, that once in 2019 the other two companies came in and turned out to be three companies, something that Sony fully expected, that everybody would assume that Sony is now going to lose the game and they will be out of the game again. Now, what is clearly happening at the moment is that nobody's really on the technology side even touching where Sony is, and Sony is mid-cycle in its development. So what I mean with that is that when the others are basically now coming out with their cameras in 2018 and 2019, Sony will probably wait another full year. Maybe the A7S III will be sooner, but I would not even be shocked if they let that linger for a while. And then they are going to release new cameras. Why is this important? Because if you look, let's look at the RP, for example. You can look at basically three areas, right? You look at user base, where Canon has two cameras available to jump over to the mirrorless. You can make an argument why some people should and why some people shouldn't. New people coming in, I think the RP is clearly aimed at that crowd. So a certain part of the market will go there. Because of the brand recognition that Canon has, it will become the market leader again. I have no doubt about it. But the interesting question is not, is Sony only an electronics company, but will they actually be able to hold position number 2? And I think they will. And that, if you just look back a few years, is already amazing. Because if you now look at the line lens up, we hear a lot of talk about Canon is now releasing really nice lenses, and they are. But if we just look where Sony is at the moment, just Sony, and which is the only one of the three big ones that now decided to open up its lens mount, right? Canon said they won't open it up. Nikon said they won't open it up for now. So basically only Sony has now an open sort of lens mount, and their own lens lineup is already quite complete. So yes, yesterday Canon announced a few really interesting lenses. But let's look at them, right? Let's look at, for example, the one that's on here now, the 24mm 1.4. It's considered a very good lens. Will the Canon one be better? Maybe. Who knows? We have not seen any tests. The only thing what we have seen is that this lens has been tested quite a lot now and is considered very good, right? And we can go almost down the list, right? Let's look at a few of them. So clearly the lens problem that people were talking about doesn't exist anymore, right? These are not the cheapest lenses, but so are the Canons are not the cheapest lenses, right? So let's look at this one. So the 16 to 35, right? Considered a very good lens, right? Let's look at an old and quite cheap one in comparison, right? The 55, right? A very good lens. Not many lenses tested more sharply than this one, right? I personally don't like it, to be fair, but that's for other reasons. The 19mm, right? Macro lens, considered one of the sharpest you can buy. Even the G lineup, right? So the 24 to 105, right? A very nice lens, fairly priced. You can see where I'm going. At this moment, I'm not sure which one I have not shown. Now let's show a big one. So let's say the one of these where I have to zoom out. So the 100 to 400, not a bad lens. In fact, probably one of the better 100s to 400s that you can buy. The 1.4, a teleconverter for it. Considered a very good lens. And you can almost continue just only within the Sony brand. So will the Canon lineup be as good or even better? Well, maybe. We don't know. What we do know is that Sony at the moment has the biggest and the most complete lens lineup out of modern lenses, right? And what we are seeing now, that Canon will catch up. They might in fact surpass these lenses in quality, but that's all speculation at the moment. I've seen very little tests, especially because of the bodies which are so lacking, to be fair, with especially Canon, that we don't know. We don't know how these lenses will behave on a, let's say a 50 megapixel body, because we have not seen a 50 megapixel body on this setup. So I'm sorry I'm rambling, but I just wanted to make the point that if you look at it practically, the fact that Sony is still sort of standing is already amazing. And now it's their turn basically to react. So again, my point yesterday was they should still work on the body. They should still make it a little bit wider. In my opinion, the next body design, I really hope that they don't make it any bigger. But like the Canon RP, and that's the point I was trying to make yesterday, I hope that they do a little bit more work on the ecosystem of accepting that not everybody is the same, and that having, they should have continued, maybe I should say it like this, they should have continued where they started out with the pinky grip, that they really thought better about how to attach these external body parts, if that makes sense. Because I am not so worried about the rest. Because if you look at the rest, clearly the next step, we are already seeing that, let's be practical. Let's look at the A9, right? Notice that almost none of the other reviewers and none of the other camera brands are actually even comparing themselves to the A9. It is very likely that the A9 will be a 3-year-old camera soon, and that nothing even comes close to its performance. And that's amazing if you think about it, because Sony has to be almost ready to release a new version and new update. And where will this happen? Clearly it will happen in the internals of the camera. The lenses won't be changing, the body shape maybe a bit, maybe we will get this flippy screen, I don't know. David kind of convinced me that it's probably a good idea. I still like the flippy up design. I think it's perfect for what we need. But his argument is that the younger generation wants to have a flippy screen. And if they're in the shop, then that's a selling point. And I might agree with him. So let's see if Sony does it. And maybe they do it in a smarter way. Because I'm actually not a big fan of the flip to the side screen and then moving it over. So maybe they'll come up with a better solution. But except for that, you can argue, because I did hold and I did play with the Canon R, the Canon and the Nikon Z. I don't find their ergonomics that much better, to be fair. And also on a practical level, Canon or Sony is now the only one that still has, maybe I missed one, but as far as I know of the 4 brands, I'm not sure about the Panasonic, by the way, sorry. I have to check that one. But clearly we have all the controls that the others, and all the cameras so far, all the controls that the others don't in the full frame. See, we have basically the front dial, we have the back dial, we have the third dial, and we have compensation dial. We have a joystick, we have the touchscreen, which also works in the same way that I was seeing several reviewers now saying, yeah, but you actually don't need the joystick because this touchscreen is working so well now. The same reviewers were saying a few months ago, or last year, Sony has to have a joystick. Sony has to have a joystick. And what we are seeing now, especially for Canon, how confusing their clients have to be, that the trackpad is already gone because everybody hated it. Now the joystick is gone and now they have to use the touchscreen. Not sure what that's all about. But I'm rambling on, but let's get back to where I think Sony is heading and why I think Sony is in a very good position not to take out the market leader. I think you almost never see that happen. Who's in much more trouble, I think, is actually Nikon. Because Nikon, I don't think they can match or outrace Sony, while they don't have the big sort of marketing machine that Canon has. Because all the shops which are selling cameras, they won't drop Canon anytime soon. So they will be pushing these cameras, these Canon RP and the Canon R and their high megapixel version a lot. There's just no doubt about it, and it will sell a lot. And they will most likely be, if you ask me, by the end of 2019, we will see that Sony is basically in the number 2 spot which is darn good, and getting ready to take the next step. And the next step, in my opinion, won't be try to convince, let's say, the older generation. I know this doesn't sound very nice, but because they have this whole history with Canon, but I think they will be slowly getting more and more, let's say, attached to a younger generation, which kind of grew up with knowing that Sony is also a camera brand, and then evolving from there. So what will Sony do next? I think the next step is in sensors, and there Sony is in a very interesting position, because they are basically controlling all the interesting other parties, right? So Canon clearly, if you look at what they are doing with the cameras, crippling them, that's one thing, and you could argue they're crippling them because it's Canon. You can also argue, if you're really practical about it, is that yes, they are doing that in their own sort of Canon-like way, but anyone who thinks that they are also capable of doing more with the sensors at this moment, at these price ranges, I think you are just kidding yourself. I think all the brands, so the two brands which in my opinion are doing interesting stuff, Panasonic, still not sure about, but especially Fuji and Sony are both using Sony sensors. Nikon is using Sony sensors. I'm still not convinced what Panasonic is using, but clearly the best sensors and the stack sensor technology, which is even more important, is sort of Sony's area of expertise. And that's where they're going to strike next. We already are seeing that none of the cameras can even touch the current version of iDetect. And the next version of iDetect on the same hardware still has to come out, right? So over the next few months, a 2-year-old camera and a 1.5-year-old camera and a year-old camera will get an upgrade, which will put them ahead of what Canon, Nikon can do in 2019. I would be extremely shocked that by the end of 2019, Canon or Nikon will have a better I wouldn't say, yeah, but let's call it a better autofocusing system, especially in, let's say, the smarter areas. So the iDetect, the animal detect, the object tracking, that sort of things. I don't think they can even match the current version of the hardware that's inside. The same, I think, with, and people may laugh at me, but in the area of CPU power and getting data off the sensor basically to the card. Yes, Sony is now behind in some of the video aspects, but they are also running on a 2 or 3 years old internal design, right? So they're mid-cycle and they're about to go to the next cycle. What can happen then? Well, look at what happened with Fuji, right? They're probably the first one who really replaced the internals on the CPU side, and see how much improvement the X-T3 now, for example, has made. It's a major upgrade compared to the other one. I think interesting things are ahead, and I think if I gave the feeling yesterday that I think Sony is in trouble, no, Sony is not in trouble. I think they are doing extremely well. I think especially the fact that we now get competition, and Sony will lose market share. Not just a little bit of market share, Sony will lose a lot of market share in the mirrorless space. And they kind of have to, because if you think about it on a practical level, what did people expect would happen, right? Clearly, especially with what Canon is now doing, they are trying to stop the DSLR part quicker than probably most people expected, right? They're really fully going for new lenses. They're releasing a low-end camera, which actually is more trouble for Fuji and Sony in the APS-C sort of area than in the full frame area. But specs-wise, both the at every price point, nobody at the moment is able to match the full frame performances of the Sony. Yeah, that's all I kind of wanted to say. I think we are living in very interesting times, and 2019 is actually going to be remembered as the year that all the brands jumped in, and where Sony is now preparing. I've talked about this in a video before, but now all the brands are out. They all have now released 2 cameras, which was kind of what Sony started out with, right? So 2 or 3 cameras, the same sort of body designs, and then focusing them differently. The other brands seem to be following this logic, right? So doing a low end, low pixel one, a mid pixel one, and a high pixel one, and sensitivity model, and etc. etc. It seems that the other brands are following that idea. And Sony will slowly start rolling out these new versions of these bodies. And I think it's going to be very interesting, simply because now the competition has really started, and it was way better than when Sony was the only game in town. So if people got the impression that yesterday I was sort of trying to make the argument that Sony will be dead in the water, no, I just pointed out there was one area where they are clearly now behind. There's other areas, by the way, and some of them are quite funny. Sorry if I'm rambling on. But if you look at the screens, right, most of them in the other brands are actually coming from Sony. If you look at the EVFs, right, so the new 5.6 megapixel ones that was just announced in was it the Panasonic, if I remember correctly, is a Sony one. Most of the other brands are using EVFs made by Sony. So weirdly enough, some of the Sony components, which are now gaining traction on Sony, are actually coming from Sony, and they will be rolled out in their own hardware. Anybody who thinks that some of the sensor technology that Fuji now got won't be in the next cameras that Sony is using, if anybody thinks that the EVF that they now sort of release to other brands won't be either the same or better ones in their own next cameras, is just being silly. They are. And we still haven't seen, and that's mostly the most tricky one, we still haven't seen any of the brands being allowed to combine the sensor technology with stack sensor technology with the LSI sort of concept, so the 3 steps, that basically makes up the heart of these Sony's cameras now before they go to the cards, right? In fact, even yesterday we have not seen any camera with 2 card slots from the big 2 brands. Now, we can jump over it like this detail, but it's not, right? So technology-wise, Sony is in a very good spot, and they're the ones now which will be first on their new hardware release cycle. So, yeah. I think the state in 2019 will end up, Sony will take 2nd place, although they will have much better technology. I think 2020 they will hit back with even more technology. They will keep outpacing. I'm also more than willing to make that prediction. I think they will keep outpacing in the number of lenses Canon and Nikon. I think they will release more lenses, so they will keep the lead in the amount of lenses that they have, even without counting the Tamrons and the Sigmas of the world, and also the other brands, the Batis, the Zeiss lenses. The ecosystem of lenses for E-mount will be bigger and will stay bigger than the Canon and the Nikon ones. Because the old ones, sure, you can use adapters and that will work for a while, but that's not where Canon and Nikon want to go, because their money-making part will be the lenses and it won't be the cameras. So at some point they need to start pushing these newer lenses, and first they have to have these newer lenses, otherwise you can't push them. So yeah, see you in the next one, which will most definitely be back to business, in that we will try to make short videos where I'm just talking about 1 or 2 features or fiddling around with technology and showing you what I'm doing, instead of making a long video on why I think people misunderstood me yesterday. So see you in the next one, and bye bye.